Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Return Missionary Next Chapters podcast. I am your host, Sid Bassett. Today's guest, Nate Sharp, has a life that at first glance looks like a straight line of faith and success, but the reality is far more complex and far more powerful. He's a descendant of Brigham Young, a returned missionary who served in Korea, a father of 5, and currently serves as a leader in the church and as the dean of a prominent business school in the United States. But behind that resume are defining moments of uncertainty, loss, and deeply personal revelation. From watching his sister fight for her life as a child with leukemia, to seeing his parents' marriage end in divorce right before his marriage began, to asking God to close doors on the future he thought he wanted, and then walking away from a clear path in consulting to pursue a PhD he never had planned on. His story is one of learning to trust in the Lord when the path looks a little uncertain. And through it all, including the loss of a newborn daughter, his life reflects what it means to hold on to faith through both disruption and blessing. Today we're talking about how a mission can shape not just what you do, but who you become, and how that influence carries into every chapter that follows. Nate, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sid. Good to be here.
I guess I should call you Dean Sharp. I apologize for that. I guess that'd be more formal.
Not a chance.
Well, it's just so wonderful to have you on the show. So I'm going to start with your family early on. I'm playing back some of what I've read, and then you and I have talked about this somewhat, but you're a descendant of Brigham Young. I don't know what a family reunion looks like for a Brigham Young descendant family, but how did that influence your life, knowing of your relation to somebody so deeply rooted in the gospel of Jesus Christ?
Well, for starters, my father's middle name was Young. My middle name is Young. My brother's middle name is Young. And so I guess I would start by saying that the connection to Brigham Young was always something I felt a sense of pride about and was grateful. It was very salient in my life. It was something that I think influenced just the way I tried to live my life. So, I felt a pretty strong connection to early church history throughout my life. And I guess maybe one reason for that is the connection to Brigham Young. But I loved learning about him, about the prophet Joseph Smith, about church history generally. And I think that was a meaningful part of my identity growing up. I'll also say, in a kind of a final response to that question, that the older I've become, the more I've recognized about really everyone in church history, but including my own great-great-great-great-grandfather, Brigham Young, that they were all human as well, obviously, but they were nuanced humans. And Brigham Young, I suppose, made some decisions and had aspects of his leadership and even personality that I've read about and kind of go, gosh, Grandpa, what were you doing? Or what was that all about? And I actually am grateful that I can see him and the prophet Joseph Smith and others in church history and recognize their humanity, but not fault them for it. And somehow that family connection has been helpful in that regard. And then lastly, I don't think there was anyone in Joseph Smith's life who was more loyal to him than Brigham Young was. He had a lot of, members of the church early on, family members of his own. I guess perhaps Hiram would be up there in competition with Brigham Young. But I've also loved just knowing that my own ancestor was someone who was deeply loyal to the prophet Joseph Smith during his life.
I love that. I love the word nuanced, the relationship with church history, because there's a lot there that's not super easy to understand, and it can be quite complex. I also know that the closer you get to church history, the more you know, but the more you appreciate the people who actually were involved in the restoration of the gospel, because that was not an easy time. And it's hard for us to transport ourselves back in that day and understand all the nuance that you do have to understand to appreciate those those individuals in early church history. I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you. I love how it's rooted in you. And even though your testimony has been developed on its own and you've had to feed it the nutrients of faith and the doctrine of Christ that builds to its ultimate conversion, you had some reason to do that. Your middle name itself reminded you of how important that was. And I appreciate you sharing that with us.
Thank you.
So you grew up, not everyone gets the privilege of living near family. You
Yeah.
grew up not only near family, but knew 3 sets of grandparents.
Yeah.
What was that like to have so much support around you all the time growing up?
I look back now on my childhood and recognize in a way that maybe I took for granted a little bit when I was in the process of growing up, just how almost idyllic our growing up situation was. We had cousins who were close by, in particular on my dad's side of the family. His sister lived very close to where we lived. And so I had my cousins on my dad's side of the family there, and then 3 sets of grandparents like you talked about. My grandparents played a really significant role in my life growing up. All 3 sets did, frankly. And then, there was also, back to my favorite word of the hour, apparently, the nuance of my dad's parents. Although my dad's mother was a direct descendant of Brigham Young, like we've talked about, they stopped attending church around the time that they were married. So my dad's father had been a real kind of a star athlete at East High School in Salt Lake City, and then was recruited to play quarterback for the University of California at Berkeley. And that sort of moved him to the Bay Area in California when he was, a young man. I think he was 17 when he left East High School to go play football there, maybe 18, but I think he told me 17. And then my grandmother happened to be out there at the time. So anyway, that was sort of his background. He did not serve a mission. And then when they got married, they just sort of, there was, as I understand it, a bit of a disagreement with their bishop, who turned out to be an extended family member, ironically enough. But they stopped attending church at that point and never became activated again the rest of their lives. And so there was this interesting dynamic. I was very close to them, as close to them as I was to my other 2 sets of grandparents. But the contrast of wanting them to be active and wishing that they were, and they would come to church occasionally. If, like, when I spoke prior to leaving on my mission, I'm pretty certain they were there for that. And they came to all of our family events. They just didn't have a lot of interest in being active in the church. But it also taught me a lot of appreciation for my father, who grew up in a home where his parents did not attend church, and yet he found a way through friends and loving, caring church leaders to gain a testimony of his own, which made me grateful. So anyway, it was a fantastic childhood. Lots of family support, particularly from grandparents and my own parents, and also the ability to see a few insights into what happens when, families either stay active or don't. And there was some divorce in the family. Obviously, my mom's parents divorced. That's why I had 3 sets of grandparents. And then I'm sure we'll talk later about my own parents' divorce, but having a window into that sort of aspect of family relations also, I think, was insightful and gave me an education that I suppose I wouldn't have been able to receive in any other way.
So a bunch of underachievers I see in your family. It is something that many of our listeners will have experienced, either their parents, siblings, grandparents who departed from the church for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And then they had to sort of hold the torch. And I love your appreciation for your dad carrying on in that way. And I suspect your mother, much the same. They raised you in the gospel, in the church. And I know that even at a young age, before you were even baptized, I think it was like the age of 7, there was some illness of your older sister, Stephanie.
Yeah.
And that had a real impact on you. So could you take us through what that looked like, and then we'll get to maybe the relationship that it had on your parents. But
Yeah.
let's talk about that and introduce her to the audience, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can still remember when my parents got the news. So my sister had started to, just sort of seem really ill and didn't have a lot of energy and just wasn't herself. And I think my parents recognized that something was wrong, but of course they didn't know what was going on. And so I know that they did some testing with our family doctor, who actually was a member of our ward in the Salt Lake area. And eventually the results came back. I'm sure they did some blood tests and other things. And I remember just the fear and the concern, the worry around, a childhood cancer diagnosis for their daughter, my parents' daughter, my older sister. She's their first child. And she was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. I think I'm saying that right.
Lymphoplastic. Mm.
Yeah. Which, I'm not a medical doctor by any stretch of the imagination, but my understanding is, at least back in the sort of mid 1980s, that was effectively as close as you get to a death sentence in terms of a cancer diagnosis for a child. And I think it's the most severe form of leukemia, as it turns out. So I just remember a lot of worry, a lot of tears, from my parents, and recognizing that they were about to embark on this journey of trying to help my sister go in, get the cancer under control and into remission. But it was going to be a difficult road, and there was a very real risk that there would not be a happy ending in terms of how the cancer played out. And so I remember very vividly, my sister being in the hospital for long periods of time, the chemotherapy, the radiation treatment. I learned as a young boy about what they called a spinal tap. And I thought, I can't even imagine someone putting a needle into my back like that. And she had to do that multiple times, obviously. And then her hair fell out. She had to withdraw from school. It turned out, so she was treated by doctors at Primary Children's Hospital in Salt Lake City. And I didn't fully understand all of this, of course, at the time. But later as an adult, what I understood better was that she was part of an experimental treatment for ALL. At that time, I don't know if it was a clinical trial or exactly how they developed the protocol that they used for the treatment, but she was one of the first, if not the first, to be treated in that manner. And all these years later, when I was married and an adult and had my own children, I was in Utah at one point and talked to someone who also had a child who went through treatment for acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And Primary Children's Hospital was still calling it the Stephanie Sharp treatment 30-something years later, maybe 40 years later, actually.
Wow.
So it's quite remarkable that she was fortunate enough to go through that treatment. Her cancer went into remission. But I do remember, when I was baptized, for example, at age 8, my parents really wanted Stephanie to be there at the baptism. And so she was there, but because her immune system was compromised, almost no one else could be at my baptism.
Wow.
And so I was confirmed, right there in the same room as the baptismal font at the Stake Center after baptism, which was not, I normally saw, my friends were all being confirmed in sacrament meeting, and I didn't have that experience. And there were very few people at the baptism, just to protect my sister from any kind of compromising situation for her health. So those memories are vivid. Of course, I think it probably goes without saying that financially, it was a tremendous challenge for my parents. Even as a kid, I felt the strain of all of that stress financially, the fear of losing their daughter, and then also just the challenge of being at the hospital so frequently for all the treatments that she was receiving. It was a major experience for my family to go through, most of all for my sister, obviously, to endure that. But thankfully, in the end, her cancer did go into remission. She is alive and well and healthy today. She's about 2.5 years older than I am. She has a family of her own. She's given birth to 2 children, a son and a daughter. And those were the kinds of things that when her diagnosis first came through, I don't think very many people would have thought that those things were likely in her future. And yet they've all played out that way.
I'd call that a miracle. That's wonderful.
Yeah, definitely.
And I don't want to go on a tangent here, but my best friend growing up, he got leukemia, and it was at a very young age, not quite as young as your sister, because she would have been 9 or 10, if I'm not mistaken. So he was a few years older. And what I do remember that, because he had it, he went through the whole radiation as you just described, and then he went into remission. Unfortunately for him, it came back, and then he ended up passing away at the age of 17. But what I do remember about that was that the entire focus of the family was on Eric. It was on him, right? And everyone else sort of got lost in the shuffle. I mean, because you could see the weight and strain, just like you said, of your parents, not just financially but emotionally, the toll it takes on you to see their daughters, Stephanie, have to go through this. And that, you only have so much energy. I mean, you can't give all. So maybe it was and indeed a great blessing that you did have so much support around you. I don't know. Your parents probably were the perfect parents, right? But you can be perfect parents, but you're refocused on other children. And I've seen that firsthand in my friends. So
no, that's really interesting. I think you're right. It was definitely a blessing to have all the additional extended family support in the area. I also remember our entire ward having a special fast for my sister, to add their faith and prayers and fasting behind it all, which I thought was really quite remarkable. But I don't remember, of course, my 2 younger siblings might have different memories. I don't remember feeling neglected in any way or feeling like so much attention was on my sister that I was being kind of lost in the shuffle. I can see how that would happen easily in many families, but I think my parents, to their credit, managed to do a pretty good job kind of juggling all of these challenging dynamics with that situation in a way that I'm sure, played out as well as they could manage, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, as a parent now, you can appreciate that even more. That's not easy to be a parent to all. And I think that's wonderful that you at least, notwithstanding your siblings, but you at least felt that security at a very vulnerable age where security is very important. So I love that.
Definitely.
Okay, we're going to fast forward a little bit, and you decided to serve a mission. Was that always in the plan?
It really was. I can't remember a time when I ever wondered about whether I would serve a mission. I actually looked forward to serving a mission really my entire life. My father, again, even though his own parents were not active, and his older brother, he has one brother, his older brother did not serve a mission himself, but my dad chose to serve a mission as a young man and served a mission in Scotland, and that's where at least the ancestors on the Sharp side of the family are from. So I grew up hearing about my dad's mission and just thinking that was really amazing that he had done that. And many of my friends, older friends, went on missions before I became old enough to go, but contemporary friends that were all the same age in high school all wanted to go on missions. And so it was really something I looked forward to my whole life.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So you go to Korea. Are you a K-pop fan? Are you do you follow Korea that much? And
when I love Korea as much as anyone I've ever met who served there, for example. So love the food, love the culture, love the language, love the people. My wife and I have enjoyed a couple of they call them K-dramas, I guess. Korean,
K-dramas. Yeah.
They're on Netflix, for instance. I don't really listen to a ton of pop music, so I haven't gotten into the K-pop kind of phenomenon, I'll confess. But, it was interesting. I studied French for 6 years, all 3 years of middle school, all 3 years of high school, took the French AP test, and just sort of thought I would end up being assigned to serve in Canada or France or somewhere in Africa, maybe. So Korean was a big surprise when I opened up the letter. But I immediately felt so much excitement and just enthusiasm for the chance to serve in that part of the world. I didn't know a lot about Asia or about Korea for that matter, but could not have been sent to a place that was a better fit for me. I just fell in love with Korea immediately when I got there, and cherished really every day on my mission. I really loved my experience there a lot.
Yeah. Well, in preparing for this discussion, you could tell it just you bled your mission. I mean, it was everything, and it had such an impact. And we'll ask you another question or two here at the end to kind of reflect on that. So we're going to fast forward a little bit, and this is a podcast about return missionary next chapters, but your next chapters were pretty phenomenal, and so congratulations to you. But there was a time in your life where you weren't sure exactly what you're going to do. Interestingly, in talking to you, academics are important to you. I mean, you could just tell that you're thrilled for the scholarly view of the world and your professors, the church history. I love that. So you were trying to figure out what to do next. You were praying about this, and you prayed that the doors would be closed to avenues that you shouldn't go down. That's quite an interesting sort of reversal. So you're usually praying for what I need to be doing, but you pray for the doors to be closed. Tell us about that.
It was my junior year at BYU, so that would have been probably around 1999. I had started the accounting program at BYU at the business school there, the Marriott School, mostly because BYU has a tremendous accounting program, as you probably know.
I do, yes.
And I didn't go to college expecting to study accounting, but I took my first couple of classes and just sort of was dazzled, I guess, by the faculty and how well they taught, and just the way they were able to make accounting feel so important to, as the language of business and everything else. So I was headed down that path, and I developed a bit of a pretty strong interest in the idea of management consulting. I had heard about companies like McKinsey and Bain and Boston Consulting Group, and recognized that the kind of work they did seemed like something I would be really interested in. And so I thought management consulting would get me, first of all, in all likelihood, up to the Northeast, which is sort of where I thought I might, develop my career and maybe go to school. And then I thought that management consulting was also a good sort of pathway into a top MBA program like Harvard Business School. And so I had begun the interview process for those companies, as you well know, is very different from the typical job interview, for example, for the Big Four accounting firms. And so I had started doing preparation for that style of interview, and those companies were coming on campus and having informationals where you went and listened to them talk about what kind of resume format did they expect, and what's the process, how do I get a spot to interview with you. And so I was engaged in that process. And in fact, one of the companies that's not as well known as the three I mentioned, but is called Monitor Consulting, and Monitor had come on campus. And it turned out the lead recruiter for Monitor at BYU was a man by the name of Chris Williams, but Chris was my seminary teacher in high school. And we had gotten along very well. I loved his class in seminary. And so I almost took that reality that he was the recruiter as like a sign almost that, gosh, this is all falling into place and this is what I'm supposed to do. And right at the time that Monitor was there on campus interviewing, one of my professors at BYU sent me an email and said, "Hey, would you come talk to me in my office?" And I had no idea what it was about, but I went to see him. His name is Dr. Mark Zimbelman. He's still on the faculty at BYU today. But Mark was the one who asked me, he said, "Hey, what do you want to do with your life?" And I described to him what I described to you a moment ago. And he said, "Well," he looked at me and he said, "Have you ever thought about a career in higher education, pursuing a PhD, becoming a professor? Is that anything you've ever thought about?" And I said, "I'll be honest, I've never thought about that. No one in my family was a professor. I assumed that professors were paid probably pretty comparably to high school teachers, and I didn't want to struggle, or have to deal with the challenges of a pretty modest income kind of a thing." And so I just said, "No, it's really not. I don't think that's for me." And he said, "Well, we're about to launch a program at BYU that's called the PhD Prep Track within the accounting program. And I've been watching you this semester. I think you'd be really good. I think you would like academia. I think you've got kind of the mind and the disposition to really enjoy a career in this area. And I'd like to talk with you more about it. But, you've got to decide if it's something you would want to do. And I kind of said to him, more or less, thanks, but no thanks. And as I'm about to leave his office, he is the one who asked me a question that really changed the course of my life, because he said, hey, one last thing. Have you ever prayed and asked the Lord to close the doors that are not right for you in your life? And his question just totally knocked me off my chair practically. It really went right through my heart. And I said, that's an interesting question. I've spent my whole life praying for the Lord to open doors for me. No, I've never prayed and asked him to close them. And he said, I would just invite you when you go home tonight. I know you're in the middle of this interview preparation process, but I invite you to pray and ask the Lord whether going down this management consulting route and heading off to the Northeast and all of that, ask him to close those doors if they're not right. That's what I'm going to leave you with that. And Sid, something about the way he presented all of that really affected me and resonated with me. And so that night, I actually did say that prayer and just said, Heavenly Father, I don't know what's in store for me or what path you want me to go down, but if the one I'm about to kind of dive into is not the right door for me to go through, then I hope that you'll close that door for me. And I'll spare you all the details. I'm probably going on too long about this anyway, but sure enough, it was like one door after another closed in that realm that I wanted to go down, even monitor. With my seminary teacher as the lead recruiter, it just didn't work out. I interviewed and didn't interview especially well, which wasn't normal for me to kind of feel at a loss for words. And I feel like I kind of fumbled around in the interview. So I ended up deciding to really make take a pretty stark pivot and we had 7 students who entered that inaugural group of the PhD prep track at BYU in the MAC program. And that would have been around 2000 that I entered that program. So it's 26 years later, that program's been going strong for a very long time and has actually led to a very large number of Latter-day Saint faculty members in accounting programs all across the country.
Wow.
Anyway, that's kind of the story of how that all took place.
No, that's fantastic. It's interesting. This is again a bit of a side note. I was in a meeting with President Eyring. He wasn't there for me, but I was there for him.
Yeah.
And he was asked a question from one of the members of the audience. How do you feel the Spirit? Is what he was asked. And his response was very similar to what I just heard you say. His response was, I feel the Spirit strongest. He said, I feel the Spirit, right, throughout my life, but I feel the Spirit strongest when there's a door closing or that I shouldn't be going down that path.
Wow.
Or that I've chosen a path that I shouldn't pursue.
Yeah.
And I thought that was so interesting that would be the most poignant, because the Lord had a plan for him and still does have many chapters for him.
Yes.
That he would just not let you get off of the guardrail, right? So, don't go that way.
Yeah.
You can go any of these other ways, but not that way and not that. So I love that that's the way you felt that answer so strongly because of that professor who invited you to ask that question. I love that. I'm going to do that the next time I have a big decision to make. Close the door for me if that's not where I should go. Otherwise, I'm walking right through it.
Yeah.
All right. We got to get into another important post chapter for you. Just knowing you, I have every confidence that you married up. I've not met your wife, Holly, but I suspect that's the case. So I would love to hear, what about Holly, was so great that drew you in to wanting to be her forever companion.
Yeah. Well, you couldn't be more correct about me marrying up. My wife is the most amazing woman I've ever met. She is everything I aspire to be. And, it was interesting. I was 25 and about to graduate from BYU's master's program. Of course, I went on my mission at 19, like we all did back then. And because I stayed for 5 years for the MAC program, I was 25 years old, not married. I had dated some wonderful, amazing young women at BYU, but for one reason or another, it just hadn't ever led to that next step. And so I was preparing to move to Texas for my PhD. I had accepted admissions to the University of Texas at Austin for my PhD. And I'd kind of, sort of resigned myself to the fact that maybe I would find my wife there. I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but I went to a Temple Recommend interview in March of 2002, which is the year my birthday's in March. I had just turned 25, and I knew the member of the stake presidency who was interviewing me, but he essentially said to me, "What are you doing not married yet?" And I said, "President Jorgensen, I wish I knew the answer to that. I would love to be married right now." And we had most of those interviews, as you know, at BYU, it's like a well-oiled machine. They've got 100 students to interview on one evening, the 2 or 3 presidency members, and you're in and out. He spent 90 minutes with me in that interview, which is unheard of.
Yeah.
And I ended that interview with him giving me a promise, and this is the way he said it. He said, "Nate, I promise you in the name of the Lord that if you will exercise faith the way you did on your mission, you are going to meet your future wife before you move to Texas." And it was kind of an astonishing promise. But the Spirit certainly confirmed that he wasn't just making that up. Although at the same time, Sid, I'll tell you that over the next, I guess, 5 months until I moved to Texas, there were times when I thought, maybe it's kind of a Zion's camp type of promise where the Lord was testing me to see if I would exercise faith the way President Jorgensen invited me to do so. And if I don't actually meet my wife, it doesn't mean that the promise wasn't valid or that it didn't come from the Lord. It just means that the Lord was preparing me and testing me. So it wasn't that I felt like that had to come true literally.
Right.
But I ran into a girl that I had known in high school just weeks before I moved, actually. And she said, "Hey, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Oh, I'm about to graduate from BYU and I'm headed off to Texas." And she said, "Well, wait, are you married yet?" And I said, "No, I'm not." And she said, "I have got to introduce you to a friend of mine that I met on my mission." And I said, "Where did you serve your mission?" And she said, "I was in Guatemala." And so this friend of mine, Brooke, from high school, met Holly, my wife, as it turns out. That's the spoiler on the whole story, I guess. But they met on their missions in Guatemala. And Brooke said to me, "Will you please let me introduce you to Holly before you move to Texas?" And I was, a little bit like, another blind date, kind of a thing, get lined up. But I thought, why not? I'm moving in a couple of weeks. And it turns out that the way my wife thought about this, the way Holly thought about it when Brooke approached her, and she had just kind of gotten out of a relationship that didn't go super well, and she didn't want to date for a while. But Brooke said to her, "Look, if you don't like him, he's moving in 2 weeks anyway. So what do you have to lose? Like there's no downside to this. Just meet him and see what you think." And so we almost didn't meet because there were some communication sort of glitches where Brooke didn't call me to confirm, and so I thought maybe it's not happening. And anyway, long story short, luckily it happened. And so I drove to Lehi, Utah. They were in Holiday, so we kind of met halfway from Provo and Holiday. And Brooke had her fiance in the car with her, and then Holly was in the backseat. And I still remember, Sid, just even pulling up into the parking lot where they were waiting for me. And I could see Holly through the window of the car. And I remember being totally taken aback by her beauty, just her physical beauty. She is a beautiful woman. But I think what struck me the most about her that first night was she just had this almost irrepressible joy about her. She didn't stop smiling the whole night. And she and Brooke were talking about stories and experiences and just laughing together. And there was a joy and a happiness about her that I just was blown away by. And I loved the inside jokes and the stories they told and all the laughter that they enjoyed together that evening. And I could also tell, just knowing that she was a returned missionary and that she had, and at that time, as you know, young women serving missions was really quite uncommon. And she had finished her schooling at Utah State, did the nursing program there. She was working as a nurse. She was actually the mission nurse in Guatemala for half of her mission. And anyway, so I would say her obvious testimony, she was beautiful inside and out. And then the joy that she just exuded were some of the things that I just thought, wow, if there's any way. And I sort of thought, I don't know how we can make this work with me moving soon, but it was love at first sight for me, no question about it.
Wow. I mean, if men are, they might have joy. I can't imagine an irrepressible joy coming out of someone and not wanting to be near them forever. I think that's absolutely a wonderful love story. And no doubt you have experienced significant joy. There's just a couple more things that I want to ask. One of them is related to testing your joy. You lost a daughter, Kate, at a very young age. And I know that is incredibly difficult for people and relationships. I hate to be so heavy right here at the end of the conversation, but tell me how the two of you handled that in your life and what that's meant to you ever since.
Yeah. Well, actually, thank you for asking about it, first of all. It was a really difficult experience to have, but it became such a formative experience for both of us, Holly and me, and our family, our children. It's really shaped the rest of our life since that experience. And so I guess I would say I can't imagine going through that experience without my wife. She was such a source of strength and faith and just peace. She didn't ever worry. We didn't know that anything was wrong with Kate until she was born. And even I was there when she was born. I couldn't tell anything was wrong when I saw her. But it turned out she had a condition that she had some heart problems and other problems as well. They picked up on the heart problems first and eventually sent us to Houston to the hospital there, Texas Children's, which is one of the premier children's hospitals in the nation. But then while we were there, we discovered that she had even more problems, a chromosomal problem that was going to make life really difficult. But she passed away at 1 month old. So we were in the hospital for about 10 days, brought her home, knowing that she might live for a year, she might live 6 months. We didn't know how long she was going to live. A doctor who would come to the house weekly and a nurse who would come even more often just to make sure things were okay. But it was a very difficult loss, no question about it. It was a blessing to have Kate in our home for the 3 weeks that she was there. She was just the most peaceful, incredible child. Everyone that came to see her, when they would hold her, it was like, wow, you could almost feel heaven close by. But I would say it was, above everything else, it was the love that Holly and I had for each other and for our other children, three other children at the time, the love we felt for Kate and the love we felt for the Lord, and then our faith and testimonies of the Savior, of Jesus Christ and the plan of salvation. That's really what got us through it. I don't ever remember feeling bitter or, shaking our fists at God or anything like that. There was never anything like that. It was much more of just like, as soon as Kate passed away, so she passed away in the morning and she was in our arms, literally, but we gathered all of our other children, the other 3, immediately into the room to talk about what had happened and to just explain to them that this was just a step in the process for Kate, that she needed to come here to have this mortal experience. It wasn't long, but this wasn't something to be scared of or be upset about or to make us question, Heavenly Father's love for our family or his plan. But instead, we could recognize this as an experience that could build our family's faith, and to know that now Kate's on the other side. and she'll be looking out for us and cheering us on our whole lives. And she ended up giving us one more reason to want to stay faithful to our covenants, so that we could be with her again. We know where she's at now. And so let's all rally together as a family and live in a way that will allow us to be with her again. And we had one more child after Kate. He's our youngest now, Austin, who's 14. And he never got to meet Kate in this life. But one thing we've done, Sid, ever since Kate's funeral, just about every Sunday, we're out of town occasionally, but Kate is buried at a cemetery not far from our house. And so that was 2010 when she passed away. For 16 years, we have gone to the cemetery every Sunday.
Wow.
And just and had a family prayer at her grave. And that's been through my time as a bishop and a stake president, and we've just figured out a way to be there together. It sometimes was later in the evening, as my church callings didn't always allow me to drive home at the same time as my family, but we have been very strengthened by the experience of losing Kate, but yet having her be so influential in our family all along.
I just think about those sacred 9 months where she soaked up all that joy, from Holly, and now she's given you an eternity of joy, even in the greatest sorrow of your life. And that's a very sacred thing. And I just want to sit in that for a little bit. So I really appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you.
No doubt she is every bit a part of your family and to each of your children. So thank you. I tell you, I'm going to grab one more question from
Please.
you. That was pretty heavy, but it does show who you are. It does show who Holly is. And it shows that your understanding of that important aspect of the plan of salvation is ultimately what's carrying you through. And to testify of these things is not hard for you. I mean, it is you personified. And I just love that deep-seated character you have in your testimony and that conversion.
Thank you.
So, okay, you made this a point. I'm going to make it a point. You love the rising generation.
Oh.
And I love the rising generation. So we share that in common. Tell us why your love for the rising generation. For those who are not members of the church, what does that mean? What's that vernacular mean to them?
Yeah. Well, no, I'm so glad you would ask this question before we wrap up, because the rising generation just means everything to me. When we use that term, we're referring really, it's even more broad than, at least I would define it more broadly today than maybe I did 20 years ago, but I would include primary children, young single adults, youth, really anyone sort of from, let's call it 2 years old, all the way up to now 35 years old. At least the young single adult wards, I mean, maybe I would still call them the rising generation. I love them so much. I just have such tremendous respect for them. And like you, I recognize that the world they're growing up in is more difficult in many ways than the world I grew up in and you grew up in. And then, the next generation, my grandchildren who will come around, before too long, they're going to grow up in a world with a whole different set of challenges. And yet I see such faith and such hope and light and goodness in the rising generation. We have a young single adult ward in my stake, an institute program. Of course, I'm at Texas A&M, so there's a very large, we have 80,000 students. This is the largest university campus in the entire nation, 80,000 students on one campus. And we have a very vibrant, strong, young single adult ward. But I love them all in part, with all their insecurities. Many of them, as you know, Sid, come to church on Sunday and wonder if they really belong. And they're trying to figure out what their faith is going to look like. And how much do they believe, and do they want this to be their entire life? And I love every one of them. I love the ones that walk in with a sure knowledge and a rock solid testimony and total commitment. And we have a lot of those. And I love the newest members who wonder if they made the biggest mistake of their lives when they got baptized and joined this group. And I love the ones that are lifelong members but aren't really sure where they fit and if they fit. Because I just look at them and I say to them whenever I get a chance, just the fact that you showed up, is such an exercise of faith. And I feel the Lord's love for that group, the rising generation, more powerfully than I feel it anywhere else, quite honestly. And so, and I tell them, even if you didn't show up this week, we still love you and want you to come the next week. I mean, it's just like it's almost like they can do no wrong. And even when they might veer from the path a little bit, which all of us do to one extent or another, I just know the Lord wants them back. And it's like President Uchtdorf has said recently on numerous occasions. I've heard him say, stop calling them the future leaders of the church. They are the leaders now. They are the leaders in the present and the future. And so I just see the way the church will be carried by them. It's being carried by them now, and they will carry the church into the future. And so for all of those reasons, I love them. I know it's hard to come home from a mission often and readjust. And I know that I love the ones who struggle with that and would give anything to just put my arm around them and say, it's going to be okay. Like most of us struggled to find our way when we came back, but to tell them, we need you and we want you, and the church is diminished. I feel this way, that the church is less, it is diminished when even one of them decides to walk away. And, like the Savior who left the 99 to find the one, I would give anything to help one of them come back if they have struggled. So I love them deeply and have tremendous confidence in them.
That is the perfect way to end this podcast. Nate, Dean, fellow disciple of Jesus Christ, I have been inspired by you. I feel my testimony strengthened because of your life and the way you live your life. I really appreciate you offering this time to us and sharing this for our listeners. I know they will be richly blessed as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sid. It was a tremendous honor. I loved the time with you. Thank you for what you're doing for Return Missionaries. I love the idea of this podcast, and I enjoyed every minute. So thank you very much.
Thank you.